Imagine a moment when America stood on the edge of collapse, an existential crisis so deep that many believed the dream was over. Yet, time and again, when it seemed the nation would fall, it rose from the ashes stronger than before. This is not myth. It is history, and it begins with one of the darkest days America ever faced. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, the day the roaring 20s crashed into silence. Wall Street imploded. In a single week, fortunes vanished. Men who had worn fine suits now sold apples on the street corners of New York. Families who thought they'd secured the American dream stood in breadlines, clutching ration tickets. By 1933, more than 15 million Americans were out of work, 1 in every 4 workers. Detroit's great automobile factories sat cold and quiet. Across the Midwest, nature itself seemed to conspire against survival. The Dust Bowl, vast storms of dirt and ash, swept across Oklahoma, Kansas, and Texas, blotting out the sun, burying farms and suffocating livestock. Families loaded their lives into battered trucks and rattled down Route 66, desperate for salvation in California's fields. They became the Okies, wandering refugees in their own land, facing prejudice, hunger, and despair. In cities, the suffering was no less stark. In New York, breadlines stretched for blocks. Chicago's bustling streets became stages of desperation. St. Louis built sprawling shanty towns the people bitterly called Hoovervilles, after President Herbert Hoover, whom many blamed for the calamity. By early 1933, the crisis was not only economic, but existential. Whispers of democracy's collapse spread. Some Americans looked abroad, to Mussolini's fascism in Italy or communism in the Soviet Union, wondering if authoritarian rule was the only way forward. And then, into this storm, stepped Franklin Delano Roosevelt. On March 4th, 1933, with the nation hanging by a thread, he told the American people, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." With a New Deal, Roosevelt ignited a bold experiment in national renewal. The Civilian Conservation Corps put hundreds of thousands of young men to work planting forests, building trails, and preserving natural wonders. The Tennessee Valley Authority electrified the rural South, bringing light to homes that had never known electricity. In 1935, the Social Security Act created a safety net that would endure for generations. The recovery was slow, but for the first time in years, hope flickered. America was learning, painfully, how to rise again. But this was not the first time the United States had stared into the abyss. To understand this pattern of collapse and renewal, we must go further back, to the ashes of the Civil War. 1865. The war had ended, but the cost was unimaginable. 620,000 dead. Cities like Richmond and Atlanta lay in ruins. Plantations were shattered, and millions of enslaved people were suddenly free, but left with almost nothing. And then, just days after Appomattox, tragedy struck. April 14th, 1865. Abraham Lincoln, the man who dreamed of healing the nation, was assassinated at Ford's Theater. At the very hour America most needed unity, it was leaderless. Yet in the years that followed, the nation attempted something unprecedented: Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment, 1865, abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, 1868, granted citizenship to all born in the United States. The 15th Amendment, 1870, extended voting rights regardless of race. The Freedmen's Bureau, founded in 1865, built schools, hospitals, and offered aid to millions of newly freed African Americans. For the first time, black men were elected to public office. In Mississippi, Hiram Revels became the first black senator in 1870. In Louisiana and South Carolina, legislatures included both black and white representatives, something unimaginable just years earlier. For a brief, shining moment, America seemed capable of reinventing itself completely. But the experiment was fragile. In 1877, federal troops withdrew from the South, ending Reconstruction. White supremacist violence surged. Jim Crow laws rose like a shadow across the South. Lynching and terror campaigns stripped away many of the hard-won gains. Yet even in failure, seeds were planted. The constitutional amendments remained. Black churches and schools endured. The memory of what was possible could never be erased. But crisis did not wait. In 1873, the banking giant J. Cook and Company collapsed, triggering the first major national depression. Railroads folded, factories closed, and workers marched in the streets of Philadelphia and Cleveland. In 1893, another crash struck. The Philadelphia and Reading Railroad failed, setting off a chain reaction. By 1894, unemployment soared to 18%. The Pullman strike in Chicago turned bloody when federal troops opened fire, killing more than 24 workers. Once again, the nation seemed at risk of tearing apart. And once again, a new era was born, the Progressive Era. Reformers like Theodore Roosevelt confronted monopolies, challenged unsafe food and drugs, and demanded protection for workers and consumers. Journalists, muckrakers like Upton Sinclair and Ida Tarbell, ripped the veil off corruption and corporate abuse. Step by step, America clawed its way toward renewal. By 1900, the United States was both thriving and trembling. New York swelled past 3 million residents. Immigrants flooded Ellis Island, reshaping the nation's culture. Yet slums festered, corruption spread, and poverty endured. Many doubted the Republic's survival under such strain. And yet, the pattern repeated. Collapse, then resurgence. Crisis, then renewal. To see why, we must look deeper, not just at politics or economics, but at faith and identity. For it was not only governments and laws that pulled America back from the brink, but something more profound, the power of belief. In the early 1800s, after the War of 1812 left doubts about the young republic's strength, a spiritual movement swept the land, the Second Great Awakening. From the 1820s through the 1850s, revivalist preachers like Charles Grandison Finney set fire to the so-called burned-over District of New York. At open-air gatherings, thousands wept, prayed, and vowed to transform their lives. But the movement did not stop at the church doors. It fueled the fight against slavery, inspired the push for women's rights, expanded education, and energized reform across the nation. In 1801, at Cane Ridge, Kentucky, an astonishing 20,000 people gathered in a frontier revival, one of the largest public gatherings in American history at the time. For days they prayed, sang, and shouted. It was a nation uncertain of its future, finding meaning and strength in something greater than itself. That spirit of renewal would later echo in the abolitionist movement, in the fight to preserve the Union, and in the resilience that has carried America through every trial since. The lesson of these early chapters is clear. America's survival has never been guaranteed. Time and again it has fallen to its knees. And yet, just when collapse seemed certain, a spark ignited in politics, in reform, in faith, or in the people themselves. Every crisis, from the Civil War to the Dust Bowl, from the Panic of 1873 to the Great Depression, carried within it the seeds of resurgence. This is a forgotten truth of American history. The ashes were never the end. They were the beginning. By the mid-20th century, America seemed unstoppable. The Second World War had ended in victory, and the United States emerged as the most powerful nation on earth. Its factories thundered with production, suburbs spread like wildfire across the land, and the post-war baby boom filled neighborhoods with laughter and promise. It was the age of abundance, or so it seemed. Yet, beneath the surface, the old rhythm stirred once again. That familiar cycle of decline and renewal, collapse and resurgence, was waiting to test a new generation. The first challenge came not from battlefields or breadlines, but from the sky. October 4th, 1957. The Soviet Union stunned the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. Americans looked up into the night, watching a tiny bit of light moving across the heavens. For many, it wasn't just a marvel, it was a warning. If Moscow could put a satellite into orbit, perhaps it could send nuclear missiles crashing down from space. Panic spread through Washington. Commentators declared that America had fallen behind. That decline was already underway. But the nation responded with remarkable resolve. In 1958, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, pouring money into science and mathematics. That same year, NASA was born. A decade later, on July 20th, 1969, the world watched as Neil Armstrong placed his boot on the surface of the moon. What had begun as a moment of fear was transformed into one of the greatest triumphs in human history. Yet while rockets soared to the stars, turmoil ignited on the ground. The civil rights movement forced America to confront its deepest wounds. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that segregation in schools was unconstitutional. But when 9 black students attempted to enter Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, in 1957, they were met by angry mobs and the Arkansas National Guard. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to send federal troops to escort them inside. The struggle only grew fiercer. From the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955, sparked by Rosa Parks, to the March on Washington in 1963, where Martin Luther King Jr. declared his dream, the movement demanded change. But the backlash was violent. In Birmingham, police unleashed dogs and fire hoses on children. In Selma, marchers were beaten on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And in April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, shattering millions of hearts. Cities burned with grief and rage. From Watson, Los Angeles in 1965 to Detroit in 1967. To many, it seemed America was teetering on the edge of another civil war. As if this was not enough, another storm gathered thousands of miles away. Vietnam. What began in the 1950s as a small mission to advise South Vietnamese troops became, by the mid-1960s, a full-scale war. By 1968, more than 500,000 American soldiers were in the jungles of Southeast Asia. That January, the Tet Offensive exploded across South Vietnam. Coordinated attacks that stunned the U.S. military and proved that victory was far from certain. For the first time in history, television brought the brutality of war into American living rooms every night. Helicopters roaring over burning villages. Soldiers crouched in rice paddies under fire. Body bags lined in rows. The images eroded trust. Protests erupted across college campuses. At the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, demonstrators clashed violently with police. And on May 4, 1970, at Kent State University in Ohio, National Guard troops opened fire on unarmed students protesting the war, killing 4. The nation's faith in its leaders collapsed. And then came Watergate. June 17, 1972. 5 men were arrested breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters at the Watergate complex in Washington, D.C. At first, it seemed minor, but as reporters, most famously Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein of the Washington Post, dug deeper, the threads led straight to President Richard Nixon. Wiretaps, secret recordings, hush money. The corruption reached the very heart of government. By August 9, 1974, facing impeachment, Nixon resigned in disgrace, the first president in American history to do so. Polls revealed the damage. In the 1960s, nearly 70% of Americans trusted their government. By the mid-1970s, fewer than 30% did. The economy faltered as well. In 1973, the OPEC oil embargo sent gas prices skyrocketing. Americans sat for hours in lines at service stations. Inflation soared even as jobs disappeared, a painful combination economists called stagflation. Factories in Cleveland, Detroit, and Pittsburgh shut their doors. New York City itself nearly went bankrupt in 1975. For many, the American century already seemed to be crumbling before it had begun. But once again, seeds of renewal began to grow in the ashes. In 1962, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring sounded the alarm about pesticides and pollution. By April 22, 1970, the first Earth Day brought 20 million Americans into the streets to demand action. The Environmental Protection Agency was born that same year. The women's rights movement surged as well. In 1972, Title IX became law, guaranteeing equal opportunities for women in education and sports. And even as factories closed, a new revolution stirred quietly in garages and workshops. In the late 1970s, the first personal computers appeared, setting the stage for a digital transformation that would reshape the century ahead. The 1980s dawned with the promise of renewal. President Ronald Reagan declared that it was morning in America. The economy rebounded. Patriotism surged, and the arms race with the Soviet Union reignited. But scandals like Iran-Contra in 1986 and the savings and loan collapse of the late 1980s revealed cracks beneath the optimism. Still, by 1991, the Cold War ended with the fall of the Soviet Union. For a fleeting moment, America stood alone as the world's undisputed superpower. But history never sleeps. The 1990s brought both opportunity and turmoil. Globalization swept jobs overseas even as Silicon Valley promised a digital future. The dot-com boom surged, then collapsed in 2000. Domestic extremism reared its head in 1995 when Timothy McVeigh bombed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. And in 1998, President Bill Clinton was impeached, a stark sign of deepening partisan divides. Yet nothing could prepare America for the morning of September 11th, 2001. At 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. 17 minutes later, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. At 9:37, American Airlines Flight 77 smashed into the Pentagon. And at 10:03, United Airlines Flight 93 crashed into Pennsylvania Field after passengers fought back against hijackers. By that afternoon, the Twin Towers had collapsed into smoke and ruin, and nearly 3,000 lives were gone. The War on Terror began. U.S. forces invaded Afghanistan in October 2001 and Iraq in 2003. Thousands of American soldiers would die in conflicts that dragged on for years, fracturing trust and destabilizing the Middle East. At home, life changed overnight. The Department of Homeland Security was created. The Patriot Act expanded surveillance. Airports became fortresses. Unity surged for a time, but as the wars dragged on and the justifications crumbled, divisions widened. Then came the Great Recession. September 15th, 2008. Lehman Brothers collapsed. Wall Street fell into freefall. Unemployment soared to 10%. Millions lost jobs, homes, and savings. Once again, the whispers of America's final decline returned. And yet, renewal followed. In November 2008, Barack Obama was elected the first African-American president. His election symbolized the fulfillment of promises first made during Reconstruction. Stimulus programs and bailouts saved the auto industry. Slowly, the economy recovered, but new storms loomed. The 2010s brought the rise of social media, connecting billions, but also fueling misinformation, polarization, and anger. Occupy Wall Street in 2011 demanded economic justice. Black Lives Matter, founded in 2013, called America to reckon once again with its deepest racial wounds. In 2016, Donald Trump's election revealed how fractured the nation had become. And then came 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic shut down the nation. Hospitals overflowed, cities emptied, and over 1 million Americans died. At the same time, the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis on May 25th sparked nationwide protests, echoing the cries of earlier generations for justice. For many, it felt like collapse had finally arrived. And yet, resilience endured. Vaccines were developed at record speed, an achievement of science unparalleled in human history. Communities found ways to support one another. And in the midst of division, a record number of Americans turned out to vote, proving that the instinct for democracy was still alive. The lesson is clear. Every generation has faced the abyss, and every generation has found a way to rise. America's history is not one of endless decline, but resurgence again and again from the ashes. The 2020 election saw a record turnout, even as misinformation and polarization poisoned trust. On January 6, 2021, the U.S. Capitol was stormed in scenes unthinkable in the world's oldest democracy. Once again, America stood at the brink, democracy itself in question. And yet, the pattern endures. Even as crises mount, political division, climate change, technological disruption, America finds renewal. Vaccines ended mass lockdowns. Young leaders emerged, demanding change. Innovation in technology, renewable energy, and medicine points to new horizons. The story of America has never been one of easy triumph. It has been a story of collapse and resurgence, ashes and fire, despair and rebirth. From the Civil War to the Dust Bowl, from Watergate to 9/11, from the Great Depression to the Great Recession, the pattern is clear. America falls, and America rises. The question is not whether crisis will come again. It will. The question is whether, once more, America will rise from the ashes. If history teaches us anything, it is this. Collapse is never the end. Renewal is always possible. The story of America is not finished, and you are part of writing the next chapter. So stay curious. Learn the lessons of history. And never forget, the resilience of a nation is born in the resilience of its people. Will the 21st century be remembered as America's final decline, or its greatest resurgence? Can democracy survive polarization in an age of misinformation? What lessons from past crises can prepare us for the storms yet to come? And perhaps most importantly, when the next collapse comes, who will lead the resurgence?